I love hearing storytellers, and one such person is Pam McGrath. She's a pastor and a member of the National Storytelling Network, and she tells about the first time she was invited to tell a Bible story in church as a professional storyteller. She called her grandmother. Her grandmother had told her that every person has a gift. Everyone has a gift, and you, she said, Pam, have a gift. And so when she called her grandmother, she said to her, I have found my gift, and it's storytelling. And grandmother said, good, honey. What are you going to do with it? And she said, I'm going to tell my favorite story in church, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And there was a pause. Where will you be? Asked grandmother. At the church near Mama's house, Pam replied. No, honey. Where will you be in the church? Surely you will not be standing on the altar in the pulpit. Pam felt, she reports, as if a soccer ball had hit her in the pit of her stomach. Well, I don't know, she said to her grandmother, who had loved her for 35 years. And she heard her reply. Have you ever heard that? Can have many meanings. The conversation in today's scripture must have been one of those moments for St. Peter, or Simon Peter as we know him. St. Peter, Simon Peter, Cephas. And it should have been for Simon and the disciples a time for parties and celebration. You read about what was going on last week. There had been the great confession of who Jesus was. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Peter had said that. And then Jesus had said to Peter, here are the keys to the kingdom. You will be the one on whom I will build my church. And so why wouldn't there have been now reported in this gospel celebrations and parties, a parade, a processional? But Jesus, we are told, from this time, that's how the scripture begins, from this time began to talk about his suffering and death that awaited him. And Peter and the other disciples had been expecting not suffering and death, but a triumphant Messiah, anointed one of God. There had been an expectation that God's anointed one, Messiah, would overthrow the Roman rule, and that the Jewish nation, as it had been under the Maccabees or even King David, would be reestablished and they would come into their own. And by having the keys of the kingdom, they would be his ministers, his staff in this great divine government that was to come. But Jesus said he would suffer and that he would die. Peter, in the text we read, takes Jesus aside. It's the disciples there, not the public. It's just the disciples. Jesus takes him aside and admonishes him, saying, God forbid. And then Jesus turns to Peter and reminiscent, if you again think about this, of the chapter 4 in Matthew's Gospel of Jesus' encounter with the tempter, Jesus says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. He's not a rock now, he's a knucklehead. Get behind me, Satan. And this must have been, wouldn't you think, like a soccer ball, a punch in the belly for Peter. It was a harump to his very self, his very being. And for the other disciples who were to hear this, and for those of us who are Matthew's readers. Now remember, this is just the disciples and just us that are privy to this. Jesus is not speaking to the crowd. It's the disciples. It's the followers. And we today are the followers as a part of Matthew's gospel. We are his congregation, and we are there with him. And we too are being hit in the belly with this word that Jesus gives, that I will suffer and will die. Now, if you are a student of the Bible and have been following this through Sunday school and through your years of experience, and I'm assuming most of you are part of the church, because that's who this is addressed to. But if you're not, you can overhear what we say in our little private conversation here. But if you have been following, you know that there are, at least in Matthew's gospel, 2 more occasions where Jesus will speak this way. But this is the first. And so biblical scholars, those who study the scriptures, acknowledge that this particular text, including the confession and that we had last week, is the turning point in the gospel story. It's the hinge in the story of the gospel when Jesus turns toward Jerusalem and begins to speak of his death. And Jesus is, in speaking to them and to us this way, and Matthew is asking us, are we ready for something different? They had been expecting one thing of Messiah, something very grand and glorious that would result in parades and celebrations and rallies and great power and possessions and the protection of God from what they were about. But this turning point is asking them, are you ready? Are you ready for something different? Jesus and his disciples are on their way to Jerusalem now. And with this scripture text, we are now on the way to Jerusalem. I haven't been preaching every Sunday, so I haven't read ahead. But if you go on in the gospel from this point, we are going on a journey to Jerusalem now. We have moved out of Galilee. They're in Galilee, and they've just been going around and going down on boat trips out on the Sea of Galilee and fishing and all that good stuff and preaching and teaching. But now they're on this journey, and if you're familiar with or think about the Gospel of Matthew and remember the story of the wise men, you'll know that in Matthew's Gospel, there are many times that folks end up going a different way. I want you to read the Gospel of Matthew sometime and look for that. Look for the times when in that Gospel you think you're on one path and then you're on another. You're going a different way. And so the meaning of discipleship is learned along the way. The meaning of discipleship is learned along the way. And in that journey, we discover that we can't stay where we are. Even if we stay in the same community all our lives, we still don't stay where we are all our lives. And as we follow, particularly if we're followers of Jesus, the way, then things will change. Things change. And so Jesus is saying, and Matthew is letting us hear this, are you ready for something different now? The disciples in this telling of the story have been Jesus' disciples for some time. We're up to, what chapter is this? Oh, well. Anyway, we're way up there, aren't we? 16. We're in chapter 16. We've been that far on the journey. Then we turn a new direction. And they have been called personally by Jesus. In chapter 4, called from fishing. And chapter 9, another one called from tax collecting. We get to chapter 10, The other disciples are named, and they come from various and associated, assorted vocations. We speculate from their names and where they came from about who they are and what their vocation was before. They've been called, and by chapter 10, they have been sent out to preach and heal. So a lot has been going on with these, in this account of Matthew, all men, in their lives up until this point. And in fact, they are doing what the church is always called to do, isn't it? Preach, heal, and right before, you remember what happened right before the confession? What happened? They fed the multitude. The church preaches, it heals, and it feeds the hungry. It eats and includes all. So this is what they've been about. But now they are learning from what Jesus is saying to them what the cost of discipleship is about, and it can't be explained in advance, but must be learned, experienced on the journey. Now, some of you, myself included from time to time, have wondered about our integrity in the Christian life, since most of us didn't know what we were getting into when we joined the church. Probably if you were baptized as an infant, you didn't know much at all. And if you later were confirmed at 10 or 12 years old, you didn't know what you were getting into. Or you may have been later in life. You may have been through Emmaus, some other spiritual life event, and you begin to discover a different understanding, a deeper understanding, but you didn't know what it was right at first. And neither did the disciples of Jesus that we meet in Matthew's gospel. They will falter and fail miserably before the end of the story. Particularly in Matthew's gospel, they are portrayed that way. And as we contemplate our own shortcomings and the failures that we might anticipate in our own future, Matthew, in this gospel, gives us encouragement. At the time, he warns us in this scripture, who are sure that we have no need to prepare for something different in our lives, that we do need to prepare. And he gives us some help and encouragement for the journey. In verse 24, he quotes Jesus, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up the cross and follow me." And so that's this text is preached a lot by preachers. Two things in it. There's, of course, the thing about, get behind me, Satan. Now, you kind of get the idea of that. Now, what Jesus is doing there, we talked about that. And then there's this part, take up the cross. Think about all the music that we're singing today that relate to that. So I want to take a moment and talk about, I like to say, can we talk? I won't say that. But can we talk? A moment about the cross or crosses. I can't say that I know a great deal about crosses, and I'm talking about physical crosses. Except once I saw a very large cross in a procession that had little wheels on the bottom end so that they could roll it along. That was sort of neat. And then I saw a cross once that had a handle on it like a suitcase so that you could, carry it effectively. Not a bad. You have one like that? Not in your church. Some churches have all kinds. I didn't know. I just wanted. When I don't know. And I looked around, and you do have a cross. And I know this is different. You see all kinds of shapes of crosses. When I was pastor at the old Trinity Church in downtown Newport News, we had a procession carrying the cross on Good Friday from whichever church had the meal for the homeless in their church on that day at noon. On Holy Day, on all days of the week down in Newport News, St. Vincent de Paul, the Roman Catholic Church, has a meal for the homeless. But on High Holy Days, they have a meal for the homeless. And those of us who are protesting Christians would pick up the slack, and we would have a meal in one of the Protestant churches, which in this case only ended up being two when I was there, the Episcopals and the Methodists. Well, there were some others, but they didn't do it. And so we would have this meal, and when the meal ended, whichever church had the meal, the other church would have the prayer service, the prayers of last words of Jesus for Good Friday. And we would have a cross. We had a rather large cross that was to be carried, and we would process and walk through the streets. And it was always interesting that it was the homeless men, mostly, who were there, and they wanted to carry the cross. And they kind of began to be competitive about it and would jockey with one another who would get to carry the cross and who would be the first. And so we started, when we would make our walk, when we would stop at certain places to pray, we learned quickly that we would trade off and let somebody else carry the cross, so that by the time we got to the end, most of these men would have had a chance to carry the cross. And we would walk to the rescue mission and down to the underpass where some of them lived, and then we would pass a storefront where drugs were sold. We knew where that was, and we would go past there. And we'd stop at these places and pray. We'd go down past the old main shipyard gates where the ships of war, the machines of death and destructions are built, and we would pray there. And then we would go on down to the jail. Most were familiar with the jail, and we would stop there and pray, and then end up in the church where the service was to be held and the cross would be laid on the altar for prayers. It was interesting to me that the people who were in that procession, besides us wayward clergy that went along, were these homeless men and mostly older women. That's usually, and read the story of the crucifixion. That's who was there then. And as we walked, we would sing the thief's song. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That was one of the most powerful experiences, walking with these men, singing that song, because those guys knew about cross-bearing, and they knew who carried the cross for them. The cross speaks to us, not the difficulties and ailments and tribulations we sometimes identify. Oh, my aching knees. Oh, the difficulties I have scheduling my flights to go on vacation. How am I ever going to pay all these pledges to the church, the crosses I bear? Those are not the crosses that we are talking about. Jesus is speaking here about a different way and being ready for a different life, the denial of self in service to God. And he was getting the disciples, and he's getting us through Matthew ready for that different way in our lives. This cross is not to be sought or pursued. It's not for self-abasement or self-destruction. It's not a death wish. It's a way of life that does result in a price that has to be paid of hurt and pain from time to time. And Matthew leaves us with two proverbs in this scripture, and I call them clues. They're proverbs. Jesus spoke proverbially oftentimes, and Matthew shares them with us, and you can think of them as clues as to how we are to carry the cross. In verse 25, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will save and will find it. And here's the first clue. That self-centeredness is counterproductive and destructive and severs us from the resources of life. And the second proverb is in verse 26, the second clue. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? My mentor and teacher, Fred Craddock, used to say that we are programmed to seek power, possessions, and protection. But as we pursue those things, we will find ourselves lost in the poverty of achievement that never satisfies, or the splendid retirement going from resort to never find and be given rest. Clarence Jordan one time went into a church to speak, a magnificent church in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was no cross. And I thought about that a couple of weeks ago. I was out of town and visited a church, and there was no cross. Clarence Jordan went up to the pastor and said, "Where's the cross?" And the pastor said, "Oh, when we built this new magnificent church, we didn't want to put a cross in here. It's a downer. People will not respond well to a cross. We didn't want to offend anyone." The cross points to the resource of true life. Not just death, but also the resurrection. You're on a journey with Matthew. I wish you well in the coming weeks as you go on with him. Thanks be to God for the good news. Amen.